Hi, everybody. Welcome to this week's session of Ask Andrew. You can tune in here each week for a new video where I will be answering some different film-related questions. I actually got a lot of questions this week, so I won't be able to answer them all, but I will roll them forward to future weeks, so if I don't get to your question today, please check back next week. A new video will be posted every Tuesday evening, and you can find out about it in our weekly email blasts. And if you haven't signed up for those, please do right on our homepage, brynmarfilm.org. Also on brynmarfilm.org, you can go to our Film Studies Online page and our Theater 5 page to find a lot of great educational and screening things for you to check out while we're all sort of hunkered down in our respective places. Finally, if you like what we're doing at Bryn Mawr Film Institute during this time, please consider making a donation. All donations will go to supporting staff during this difficult time while we are closed. Okay, on to the first question. Our first question today comes from Jane, who writes, during this time of Corona, what are some enjoyable movies that families can watch together? Well, of course, there are a good number of movies that would fit this bill. So I'm going to mention two in particular that maybe not everybody knows about that I think are really, really great. The first one is a feature film from the early 90s called Searching for Bobby Fischer. It's based on a true story about a very young chess prodigy, and it was written and directed by Steven Zaillian. Zaillian is a wonderful screenwriter with a long career. He's also directed some films too, including this one and A Civil Action, a terrific legal thriller, by the way. But in any case, Searching for Bobby Fischer was a film he wrote and directed. He also wrote Schindler's List. He co-wrote the screenplay for Moneyball with Aaron Sorkin. He wrote the screenplay for Girl with a Dragon Tattoo, directed by David Fincher, and a host of wonderful other films. So he's a really, really great writer. And he's a great job directing this film. And he has some great talent working with him, not just the actors, whom I'll mention in a minute, but also the cinematographer, the great Conrad Hall, the tremendous cinematographer from the golden age of Hollywood, worked on this film, and it has absolutely beautiful cinematography that helps tell the very moving and thoughtful story about a boy who has an unbelievable knack for chess, but lacks the sort of drive and killer instinct that some of the adults around him wish he had to succeed at its highest levels. It's a great movie about growing up and dealing with the strengths and weaknesses we all have as people, and also a great story for seeing how a kid learns to deal with the sort of pressures and concerns of adults around him that he doesn't necessarily fully understand, at least not at the beginning. In addition to all the talent behind the camera, it's got some great talent in front of the camera, including Joe Mantegna, Ben Kingsley, and Joan Allen in major parts, Lawrence Fishburne in an important supporting part, and also smaller performances by Laura Linney and William H. Macy. So it's a wonderful movie, appropriate for the whole family, and I really think you should check it out. The other movie that I wanted to mention is a documentary called Batman and Bill, directed by the filmmakers behind The Art of the Steal, who are local to our area, Sheena Joyce and Don Argot, and it is based on the original research of author Mark Tyler Nobleman. And what Batman and Bill is about the, until recently, largely uncredited co-creator of Batman, a man named Bill Finger, who was responsible for so many elements of one of the most popular fictional characters of our time. And what starts out as a film that is interesting enough because it explores his life, and we hear all these luminaries from the field of comic books, and even to an extent film, talk about the contributions of this man that most people hadn't heard of. And the movie also sort of takes on the quest to help get Bill Finger credit in all of the various Batman creations that have been and are coming out for the work he did in creating it. There's also a very interesting surprise sort of twist element about Finger's life that sort of unfolds as the film is progressing. And that just gives it an added level of suspense and mystery and interest. It's a wonderful documentary. It's available on Hulu. We screened it with the filmmakers and the author at the Film Institute in 2017 before it premiered on Hulu, which is where you can see it today. And I really hope you check it out. This next question also comes from Jane. My kids think documentaries are boring. They claim they don't have a beginning, middle, and end. Are there any documentaries that kids will like? Well, there are. I kind of understand the criticism because not all documentaries are interested in following a sort of something resembling the narrative structure we're used to in our feature films, but plenty do, both by design and sometimes by accident. There are a number of choices that are available. I would suggest some of Ken Burns' earlier hour-long or 2-hour-long documentaries made for PBS about a host of wonderful American institutions, whether it's the Brooklyn Bridge or the National Park Service, specific titles about the Grand Canyon and Yellowstone, I believe. And he made a number of interesting movies about these sort of iconic American objects and places, and they're only an hour or two long, and they follow the process of the sort of creation, the idea, the building of the object or the structure or what have you, and that in and of itself creates a sort of narrative element to it. There are others as well that sort of follow along a process. March of the Penguins is a very popular film, a documentary that seems to keep kids engaged. He Named Me Malala, about a very brave and interesting young woman, is another one that comes to mind. Batman and Bill, which I just mentioned in my answer to the previous question, certainly jumps out. And also Spellbound, about kids who are participating in spelling bees, has a natural structure to it that I think would keep kids gripped and interested. Finally, I would mention a movie that might not be a natural fit for kids, but I found to have a tremendous amount of natural sort of structure and suspense to it, and that is Waiting for Superman, the documentary about charter schools and the struggles and challenges facing them and the potential problems with them, that was made by Davis Guggenheim, the man who made the Al Gore documentary about the environment that was so popular a number of years ago. That might be another interesting option if your kids are a little bit older. Jane also asks, are there any exciting movies about gardeners? Well, I'll admit that's a tough one. I don't know if I would necessarily call these movies exciting, but there are two interesting and well-made movies about gardeners that come to mind. One is The Constant Gardener, starring Ralph Fiennes and Rachel Weisz and Danny Houston, based on the John le Carré novel. And that was a wonderful film that came out, I believe, in 2005, and has all the sort of suspense and intrigue you would expect from a story based on work by that author, and wonderful performances as you would expect from those actors. So The Constant Gardener is an option, and it's not just a metaphor. The Ralph Fiennes character really does have a fondness for gardening. The other title that comes to mind, of course, is Being There, the 1979 Hal Ashby film starring Peter Sellers, which centers on the character of Chance the gardener, who is the gardener for a wealthy man, and when the wealthy man passes away, Chance sort of inadvertently embarks on a kind of wild, almost surreal adventure. Again, not a movie that I would necessarily call exciting, but a much beloved, almost cult film that is wonderfully made, and a lot of people find very intriguing and entertaining. And again, it is about a gardener, so I would consider checking that one out as well. Our last question from Jane today is a really unusual one that honestly had never occurred to me. She writes, are the animated minions inspired by the submarines in Jacques Cousteau's A World Without Sun? I can see why. They're sort of bulbous and yellow, and have the sort of eye, which is kind of like the port, one of the ports that the submarines have. And so I can see why you might think that, but I sort of looked this up and I found no evidence that that similarity is intentional, but it's a heck of a good question, and if you find out or know something different, please let me know and I'll be sure to mention it in a future edition. Thanks. Our next question comes from Mark, who writes, I realize the Academy Awards are only one arbiter of cinematic taste, but since they tend to get the most attention, my question: do you A, think that there needs to be a separate category for animated features, and B, think that there should be a Best Picture for drama and an other for comedy like the Golden Globes, or even more categories? Well, to answer your first question first, as you know, there is a separate category for Best Animated Feature, and I honestly think that makes sense. Making animated films is, in some important ways, a completely different process than making live action films. The questions of performance, of cinematography, of direction are sort of handled in some ways completely differently than they are in live action films, and I think that that warrants animated movies being in their own category. That being said, there's no reason why an animated film couldn't be so impactful and so outstanding that it is also nominated for Best Picture, the way we have seen some Best International Feature films in that category in the Academy Awards also be nominated for Best Picture, such as recent examples including Roma and Parasite. So, but I think the animated films should remain having their own category. In terms of separating out for Best Picture comedy and drama, I'm very much against this, and not only because it is something that the Golden Globes does, and the Golden Globes should be scorned at all opportunities. But I think that even though there are dramatic differences in tone, and even though comedies very rarely are acknowledged with sort of the top prize, I do think that there are so many things in common with all of the many processes involved in making these movies that despite the difference in tone and perhaps emotional response from the audience, I do think that there's more that unites such films than separates them. And once we sort of go down this road, I think the award of Best Picture kind of loses some of its import if it is subdivided in a sense. So that's my opinion, but it's just one man's opinion. Our last question today comes from Seth, who writes, as my family hunkers down for an extended period of self-quarantining, would you recommend leveraging my new Disney Plus subscription to A, watch the Star Wars series in chronological order based on release, B, watch the Star Wars series of movies in chronological order based on the storyline, or C, watch in the order of critical acclaim, starting with The Empire Strikes Back from 1980, which is named, quote, the Star Wars equivalent of Casablanca by GQ magazine. Please explain your logic in simple, family-friendly terms so I can explain the recommended approach to my family ahead of our next movie night, which right now is pretty much every night for the foreseeable future. Please, Andrew D., you are my only hope. May the Force be with you. Well, that's a very interesting question. And I can tell you that I think watching the movies in the order of their release would be sort of the last resort, because that is in some ways based on George Lucas's personal interests and when he perceived the technology of movie making being able to handle his stories and etc. And I don't think it would make for very interesting viewing at all. I also think there's a case to be made for not necessarily watching all of the movies, because let's be honest, they're not all exactly gems. That being said, if I were to suggest watching all of the movies, and with this I would also include the sort of a Star Wars story films about Rogue One, which takes place right before the original Star Wars in the chronology of the overall story, as well as Solo, and you might as well throw those in. Those are entertaining films. I would recommend strongly watching the movies in the sort of narrative order or the chronological order within the world of Star Wars. I think this will not only save some very interesting and strong entries in the series for the end, which you will need to power through that saga, And not only will it serve as a sort of interesting lesson in the changes in filmmaking styles, techniques, and technology over the various decades that the films are made, I think it will also give a new and interesting perspective to the scope and nature of the story as well. For one thing, many of us tend to think of the Star Wars saga as the story of Luke Skywalker, and I think that's not necessarily the case. There's a good case to be made that it is ultimately the story of his father, Anakin Skywalker. And I think if you watch the films in the order I've suggested, that will become more evident. So that is what I would do. Obviously, they're not all going to be as enjoyable as the most enjoyable films, but I admire your commitment, I admire your moxie, and you're absolutely right. There are certainly worse ways to spend our evenings in quarantine than enjoying the Star Wars films. Thanks very much. And thanks to everyone for all of the questions this week. Please come back next week on Tuesday evening to look for a new video with some additional questions to be answered. You can find more film-related things to learn about and do on our Film Studies Online page and the Theater 5 page on our website, brynmarfilm.org. And if you like what we're doing here, please consider making a donation to Bryn Mawr Film Institute. That will help support staff compensation during this time when we are closed and providing this programming from our respective locations. In any case, thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye.